There you go.
Well, hello everyone, and once again, welcome to our webinar. This time a Friday, special Friday webinar with the Philippines Australia Forum here at the Trobe University. Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and to honor their elders and leaders past, present, and emerging. And I would also like to, well, highlight that it is a very pleasant and special occasion for us to have Dr. Gideon Lasco with us. And as you can see, double doctor, medical doctor and PhD. And it's actually a great pleasure because among other things, Gideon and ourselves have been in conversation over the course of some time about his research. As you will see, is very important research, not only for students of political science and government, but also most importantly, the connection between broader thinking, thoughts about regime politics and medical implications particularly in societies that experience populist episodes or administration. Our guest speaker is a physician, he's a medical anthropologist, he's a writer and an academic at the University of the Philippines in Diliman and Manila, at Ateneo de Manila University, and has also had experience at Genichen University and Hong Kong University. For us, it's a real pleasure to have you here with us, Gideon, and we are now going to open the floor for you. You have your presentation, of course, to give, and then we're going to open the floor for questions and answers. Please, our participants, welcome once again to our webinar. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, you can, of course, ask questions in the chat, Q&A, and we'll be addressing them after Gideon's presentation. Gideon, floor is yours.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you to your team for putting this together. I think it's a wonderful forum for us to exchange ideas, to learn from each other in terms of the contemporary developments that have been taking place around the world and particularly in the Asia Pacific. So this is a good time, very opportune for us to, especially, it's been over 3 years since the pandemic started, and still we're seeing its consequences around the world. We're seeing changes that have taken place. We have seen the evolution. This is not just one event, but it's an evolving phenomenon. So it's really opportune for us to use different lenses, different frameworks to reflect on health crises, not just COVID-19, but also different kinds of health crises and how the particularities of our contemporary situation in terms of technology, in terms of politics, how does it shape how people respond to health crises? So let me, this afternoon, let me share with you this framework that we've been developing over the past several years called medical populism. And let me share by way of defining this, or by way of showing what this is all about, by presenting some illustrative examples of this framework from the region. So the premise of this framework is none other than the fact that medical emergencies really figure in many of our headlines today. They're breaking news and people really panic about certain health events. They get a lot of coverage from different sectors, especially politicians, media, etc. And our argument here is that because of the political situation today, that we have fragmented audiences, polarization, post-truth age, people will call it post-truth age, fake news, and all kinds of concerns about today's epistemological foundations, we see how health crises have become even more vulnerable to politicization. It's always been that way. We've always, even in times of, even if we go as far back as the plagues during the Middle Ages in Europe, we see that disease and epidemic outbreaks have always been vulnerable to politicization, but particularly now with the conditions of our contemporary time. Now, populism has been also around, and so many people have talked about populism. It's been defined in different terms, and some have already worried about its being overused because of its conceptual openness. It's broad, it being broad enough to be defined in different ways. So I would also like to take this opportunity to refine and to specify what exactly I mean when I refer to medical populism. Now, what makes medical events and health crisis particularly significant? Well, I argue that because of its materiality for people, the fact that it's a matter of life and death for many, it's even more amenable to populist performances. At the same time, they demand emergency responses. There are many issues. There are many crises in different countries, education crisis, agricultural crisis, economic crisis. But health emergencies demand urgent responses. And therefore, these performances can be very decisive. These populist performances can be very, very decisive. So we define medical populism as a political style that constructs antagonist relationship between people, between the public and those who have been put at risk by certain dangerous others. It can be the establishment, but it can also be some kind of infectious, dangerous others. I would like to highlight that the focus here when we look at medical populism is not so much on particular individuals, although they do figure as political actors. They're very important part of the framework, but our focus is not on their political careers, but in particular moments of crisis. And that this framework is not normative, but descriptive. And I will go back to that later in my concluding remarks. So there are only 4 elements that we would like to call attention to in terms of medical populism. First of all, simplification. Second, spectacularization, division, and invocation of knowledge claims. So I apply this concept in particular. So we developed this before COVID, but when COVID happened back in 2020, I saw that, oh, wow, this is really exactly what we were seeing, what we were observing, and now it's happening at a very fast pace. It's happening in real time. So I took the opportunity to, while locked down in Los Baños, in the Philippines, I took the opportunity to really observe what was going on, to look at different case studies. And until now, we've been observing how things have been evolving in different parts of the world in terms of COVID-19. But also before that, we've looked at the drug wars in the Philippines and in Asia, as well as immunization scandals around the world. So these are all health crises, and they're all very vulnerable to political performances. So what are these 4 elements that I mentioned? First of all, simplification. It's downplaying the crisis. It's offering simplistic solutions to a very complex phenomenon. It can be prescriptions. It can be wonder drugs, miracle cures. It can be explanations that are very simplistic, very, very generalized. But then they figure as part of political performances. So when in South Africa, for example, the HIV was denied as caused by a virus, then in a way we can interpret that as simplifying HIV. And at the same time, when Donald Trump, who was not even a candidate back then in I believe 2014, 2015, when there was this Ebola virus scare around the world, in particular in the US, he was calling for the government, then led by Barack Obama, to stop the flights from East Africa or from West Africa. But that became generalized to the whole continent. So a very simplistic solution, stop the flights, but that became part of the performance. So that's simplification. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we also saw how politicians like Rodrigo Duterte would downplay, especially at the very beginning. They were downplaying the virus. Oh, you're so scared. Why are you so scared about the virus? Bolsonaro calling it just a little flu, just a little colds, also downplaying it. So that's part of the simplification, and also offering miracle cures. We have since pursued this line of medical populism, and we're now developing this research agenda looking at different miracle cures, what substances exactly become part of these performances. Why ivermectin, for example? Why chloroquine? And why not other of all the many substances? So we're now looking at this, we call it pharmaceutical messianism, and we've been looking at how politicians also include these different kinds of drugs as part of political performances. So that's simplification. The second aspect of this framework is spectacularization. This is all about the dramatic responses that politicians take in response to a crisis. It can be militarized spectacles of deploying tanks, as we saw in the Philippines when there was a surge in Cebu City in central Philippines. The government deployed tanks. It was very dramatic. All over the world, we saw the deployment of army checkpoints, mobilization of uniformed personnel. So we can interpret this as part of the spectacle. That's part of the response. Dramatized rhetoric also figures as part of spectacularization. And also the use of grave statistics. For example, Duterte saying that there are 8 million or 6 million drug addicts in the Philippines. It's a gross exaggeration. It's a conflation of figures, but it's very dramatic, and it's part of the spectacle building as well. So I would say that Donald Trump, very dramatic. There was a moment when he was admitted for COVID, of all the things, but then when he went back to the White House, he dramatically removed his mask in front of all the cameras. So I would say that is also a very dramatic response. And we see Bolsonaro as well going to public squares, going to markets without a mask at a time when his own public health officials were recommending mask wearing. So that's very dramatic. The third is the forging of divisions. We see throughout the pandemic and other health crises, we see how politicians blame others for the disease. They implicate either elites or certain dangerous others in response to a crisis. We see that with, again, Donald Trump saying that it is the fault of the administration. We see this, again, Donald Trump blaming China for COVID-19. And we see this also in the Philippines, for example, where Duterte was blaming all these pasaway, or the people who were supposedly violating all of these very strict rules that they have set up. So that is part of the forging of divisions. We see also during the drug crisis in Southeast Asia, it's the foreigners who are polluting the minds of people who are being blamed for the so-called drug problem. We see that in Indonesia, foreigners bringing in drugs, foreigners trafficking, bringing in all of the substances. In the Philippines, also during the time of Ferdinand Marcos in the 1970s, the Chinese drug lords were being blamed for the drug crisis. So whether there's validity or veracity or not in these claims, we see these divisions figuring prominently in performances of populists. And finally, to make all of these simplifications, spectacularizations, and divisions, politicians make use of certain knowledge claims. For example, to claim that, I believe in Nigeria, to claim that the polio vaccine had to be boycotted, they had to claim that it was causing some kind of disease to people, or for politicians in the Philippines to claim that the dengue vaccine is dangerous, then they have to claim that it's killing children. So all of these performances require making certain knowledge claims. So for the remainder of this presentation, let me present 3 case studies from the region where we see how this plays out, how these elements can be found, and what can be learned from these different case studies. The first that I would like to present is the drug war in Thailand in the early 2000s. So in an event that foreshadowed the drug war in the Philippines with very striking parallels, we see how Thaksin Shinawatra was able to use very dramatic language to portray the danger of drugs in Thailand. So he was making all kinds of claims about how drugs were destroying people, how they were turning people, destroying the brains of people as well. He was resorting to exaggerated statistics about how many addicts there are in the country. So those were the knowledge claims. And these claims were dramatized through political performances. Thaksin himself was highlighting these in his speeches, but it was also accompanied by nightly reports, regular reports in Thai media at the time of people lying in pools of blood, people getting killed because of this drug war, as well as daily statistics of deaths, arrests, seizures, and so on. So it was a very dramatic performance. It dramatized the government's response to the crisis, especially this act of killing people. Thousands were killed in a matter of months. Again, in an eerie parallel to what happened to the Philippines in 2016. So as part of this dramatization as well, we see how Thaksin and Thaksin's rhetoric was all about dehumanizing people involved in drugs, labeling them as scum of society, dangerous others, wicked people, and so on. But the divisions were also deployed, including blaming neighboring countries for the drug problem, and of course, implying that this is from the poor, from the dangerous sectors of society. So we see how the drug war involved a forging of division between dangerous others and the public that must be protected. So it's not the only one. In Southeast Asia, we see the drug war in Thailand. We also saw this being repeated during the time of Duterte, but also in the 1970s, we see Ferdinand Marcos also using similar rhetorical devices, also forging divisions, also making claims about how drug addiction is one of the leading problems of society, and we need discipline. He used it as justification for martial law. So this is not an isolated case. We also saw it in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, with their politicians openly expressing admiration for the drug war of Duterte in 2016. So one of the reasons why I believe it's so important to analyze these events is because they influence regional politics. They get filtered through and they travel across different national policies. So after 2016 Duterte, we saw in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we saw how they also staged their own drug wars with very similar logics. Now, moving on to another case, this is the dengue vaccine scandal in the Philippines. Now, this is taking place. We have to bear in mind that for many years, dengue has been one of the diseases that people fear the most in the Philippines. Decades of decades of people really being socialized to really be concerned about dengue. And there's basis here in terms of the epidemiology. It really affects so many people, especially children. As a medical doctor myself, I've experienced bringing children to Manila in ambulances because they have dengue. And it can really be very harrowing for parents, the declining platelet, the manifestations of this of dengue, especially the hemorrhage, the bleeding. So it can be really scary for people. And so in 2016, when the Philippines was the first country to have this public rollout of this newly developed dengue vaccine, it was trumpeted by the outgoing administration of then President Benigno Aquino III. He trumpeted this as an achievement of his administration, and he rolled this out in conjunction with a campaign that was going on at that time. So he explicitly linked this achievement that he was then trumpeting to the campaign that he was supporting of his successor, his would-be successor, Mar Rojas, and his vice presidential candidate at the time, Lenny Robredo. So it was unfolding at a time of very intense politics in the Philippines, and it was rolled out. But less than 2 years later, the manufacturer of the vaccine announced that there were greater than previously disclosed risk of severe disease of this vaccine. So it was a very nuanced claim. It was a very nuanced disclosure. But regardless of the epidemiological implications, regardless of the biomedical implications of this announcement, people latched onto it, and the program was immediately suspended. At this time, there was a new president already, Rodrigo Duterte. And within days of the suspension, media was dominated by coverage of supposed victims of this vaccine, children who died, vaccinated children who were now claiming that they suffered side effects of this vaccine. Now, we know that there's over 1 million children who were part of this program. And of course, there's so many things that can happen to 1 million children 1 or 2 years later. But it did not prevent people from using this disclosure as grounds to say that the vaccine was in fact a corrupt tool. It was dangerous to begin with, and state-affiliated factions were calling for investigations of the people behind this, including the former President Aquino, as well as the then Secretary of Health, Garin. So they were calling for investigations. They were blaming these officials for the deaths and whatever adverse outcomes for so many of the children. And chief of these factions within government was the public attorney, Presida Acosta, who staged dramatized performances in front of the Supreme Court, parading parents and children, and even pictures of children who were supposed to have been killed by the vaccine. So very dramatic. She would stage press conferences. She would claim to be a crusader on behalf of all these families. So very dramatic. And again, the claim here, the knowledge claim here is that this dengue vaccine causes deaths of all of these children. And the division that was being forged is between the government at that time and this former government who colluded supposedly with pharmaceutical and medical elites to come up with these vaccines, which for the name of profit has endangered the lives of so many Filipino children. And so the outcome of this scandal was the suspension of the vaccine. And until now, it hasn't been reinstated in the country. It's been approved in many other countries without any problems. But in the Philippines, Dengvaxia remains a very controversial topic. and it caused vaccine hesitancy. It caused a sharp decline in immunization, which people say also affected the COVID-19 rollout, the vaccine rollout for COVID-19. So that was the outcome of this scandal. So finally, a very familiar case to us, COVID-19, and we can see, for example, in India, the same features of spectacularization, dramatization, simplification, division was also seen. So Narendra Modi, at the time when it was clear that the pandemic was becoming a global, well, it was becoming a pandemic, he staged this very dramatic Janata lockdown that involved the whole country. So closing everything, very dramatic, and using also rhetoric that's very strong and very dramatized. So, but alongside this spectacle of responding to the pandemic, one very prominent feature of the pandemic response in India was a downplaying of the magnitude of the crisis. So even when cases were rising, even during the height of the surges, particularly the second surge, Modi and his officials repeatedly claimed that everything's under control. We have controlled the pandemic. Very familiar to many countries, actually, this downplaying of the crisis. So we see that very prominently. And we saw also how different officials, not necessarily Modi himself, but different officials were also offering simplistic solutions to COVID, including different cures, cow urine, among Ayurvedic medicine as well. Different politicians were offering different cures or preventives for COVID. And we can say that that's part of the simplification of the pandemic. So when there was this very deadly second wave in India, one minister famously encouraged people to still go to a religious festival. Faith will protect us. Again, very simplistic, but that was the characteristic of the overall response in India. Now, in terms of forging divisions, we see also how some of the responses involved dividing or exacerbating the divisions between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority. For just to name one example, we saw how one hospital issued a ban on COVID-positive Muslim patients in particular, claiming that these patients were responsible for the outbreak because of one gathering. So again, very prejudiced, but at the same time, in line with these populist performances that involve forging of divisions. This is not unique to India. We see even in Bangladesh how the Rohingya refugees were also seen as potential vectors of COVID. We saw during the drugs concern in Bangladesh that the Rohingya were likewise implicated as potential hotbeds of drugs. So it's not really a very surprising turn to see how certain others who are already marginalized to begin with can become the objects of the forging of divisions. So in summary, all of these cases, we see simplification. Politicians downplayed the crisis at hand. They offered simplistic solutions as well. We see spectacularization through dramatized responses, rhetoric. We saw violence, a spectacle. We saw that in the Philippines during the Duterte's drug war. We saw that in Thailand, in Thaksin's drug war. We saw it in the pandemic responses of so many countries in the region. But then we also saw the divisions, the forging of divisions, and of course, making all kinds of knowledge claims. But in ending, I would like to also highlight that these elements can actually be helpful. Again, we're not being normative about whether medical populism is good or bad. Some of these elements can actually help whatever, when we think about governance, when we think about health communications, when we think about public health, we see that the flip side of these elements is that they can actually be helpful. For example, when we simplify complex events, then it can make people understand it more and make them more adherent to whatever policies we have in terms of government. Spectacularization in itself or dramatizing the response can also be a form of assurance of a government in control. One example here, for example, is the Singapore government distributing masks in early 2020 at a time when the WHO and most countries don't recommend masks, but Singapore nonetheless took the step of distributing masks even while warning that they were not effective at the time. So I would read that as an act of spectacle that was not necessary, but it nonetheless assured people that the government is doing something and that has efficacy in its own right. Now, of course, division, when we say that politicians use different medical crises to blame elites, to blame pharmaceutical elites, well, they can actually be at fault and they're not beyond reproach in terms of when we look at, for example, vaccine equity, intellectual property. So they can definitely be held accountable in different aspects of different crises. So this performance of blaming or laying responsibility on these so-called elites can actually help lead to accountability. And I think that's very important as well. So again, it's not necessarily the case that forging these divisions can be counterproductive. And finally, knowledge claims can be based on science and evidence, and they can be very important in reassuring people that the government is in control and they're informed by whatever data that is being developed by different people around the world. So when we think of knowledge and how it's contested, then we cannot also be normative about which kinds of knowledges are actually acceptable and what's questionable. So again, these elements can contribute to the response to whatever crisis is at hand. Now, based on this framework, these are some of my thoughts about how medical populism can continue to shape the pandemic. Leaders can turn to vaccine messianism, but again, I think this moment has passed. I think now we have to think of future pandemics already in terms of how this might play out. We can see that leaders will keep dramatizing their responses, whether in COVID or other crises to come. And we can also anticipate that when there's a new pandemic or whatever health crisis, then politicians will still resort to these blaming, dividing people. But the groups that will be blamed are those that already are seen as different or dangerous to begin with. So this is not de novo. We do not see people just blaming, politicians just blaming others without basis. Oftentimes they draw on what was there to begin with, the prejudice that already exists. And finally, the knowledge claims will be more contested. I think there's now a very welcome interrogation of what counts as expert knowledge. And I think we should be focused more on that because there were so many genres of expertise that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's something that we need to see how it unfolds and how these kinds of knowledges are mobilized or contested by political and non-political actors alike. So that's it for my brief presentation. I hope that we can continue the conversation in terms of the questions that you have and some thoughts that you may have as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gideon. And, you might not be able to hear the round of applause right now, but believe me that that's clapping. That was a very, very interesting, comprehensive presentation and very important, very, very important. I really, really liked how you approach it with nuance, how you capture at the end of your presentation how the ambivalence of medical populism, how it can be actually positive even under certain circumstances. It's as mind-boggling as it can be. It's a very interesting take. And I have a couple of questions myself, but I won't abuse my privilege of chairing this session. Actually, as you can see in the chat, there are already questions coming up, and we want to get to them. And we actually encourage our participants to please ask your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We're really looking forward to them. And I'll start with a question from our very own Dino. Dino Concepcion. How are you, Dino? It's good to see you here. Thank you, Gideon, for sharing your ideas. Do you think that the normalization of COVID-19's effects is also a manifestation of medical populism in a way that makes society forget, quote unquote, unresolved issues, public issues, created and compounded by the pandemic? And that's actually a very interesting question. Thank you so much, Dino, for the question.
Thank you for that question. Definitely, I think that the way politicians respond to the pandemic has shifted different times during the pandemic, and it keeps evolving. So we see, for example, how in the US, Donald Trump was initially downplaying the pandemic, and then he latched on to this vaccine messianism, and he was touting all these efforts to solve the problems through the vaccines. So it definitely evolves, and we see how even though we have precedents, so at that level, one thing that we're also looking at now is how state level or province level political actors can also be medical populists, if you will. So, and that's where we can definitely see how demanding for a normalization can be a populist performance. For example, Ron DeSantis, we see how is now campaigning based on the claim that he never really allowed this pandemic to affect Florida. And in that sense, we can see how he's challenging elites as well. So we can see also some of these elements that I mentioned figuring in this kind of claim to normalize, claiming, for example, that Fauci and the WHO and everyone, all kinds of elites, want us to think that the pandemic is still there because they will profit out of it. So there's so many narratives that can be constructed around how certain others want the pandemic to continue, and someone speaking on behalf of the people actually want to move on. So I can definitely see how that can work I can see how that can work and how that can have some political logic in certain parts of the world. But again, it also depends on the people themselves and what they feel about it. It's always a dialectic relationship between what the politicians are saying and also how it reflects what the people are looking for. So, for example, in the Philippines, I don't think that I think in the Philippines, people are still divided between those who are feeling that we have to move on. This has gone on for so long, but there's still a big part of the population that is in this mindset that, oh, we need to have these restrictions. People are still demanding for stricter rules. So I think the way politicians would respond to this will really also depend on how their publics will respond. And that's why it's very important for us to continue monitoring how politicians will respond. But also, and this is also a challenge for me by way of a research agenda, is to look beyond the top level leaders, but also look at opposition figures, look at state level and provincial, municipal level actors, and how they are also trying to perform their responses.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Thank you very much. By the way, that last comment, I was this close to commenting back the idea of looking at subnational patterns and instances of medical populism is actually quite pressing. As you say, the focus tends to be at the national level when the dynamics going on at the regional and local level can be as or even more important in practice. Very interesting. And we have another question from Dino. As the eerie parallels of medical populism reveal, labeling and assigning blame on marginalized sectors, poor, non-whites, and health deviants, what are possible starting points where scholars or aspiring scholars can collaborate across disciplines? And I think that this is a good invitation, Gideon, to reflect briefly about the interdisciplinary character of your work and the successes, but also the challenges in doing so.
Yes, thank you for that intervention, and also, this really invites us to think also of the architecture of medical populism. So definitely the politician, so the political analysis is definitely there. So political science is definitely involved in this. But at the same time, if we want to look at the resonances of these logics to publics, then an ethnographic approach can also be very vital in seeing the context of how and why these resonate with certain groups of people, and at the same time the lived experiences that take place alongside these political performances and how they are received by people who are living through. And because this pandemic, this crisis happens very fast, sometimes our research methods are not equipped. We are not really trained. Our research methods are not very anticipatory in nature. The model is for us to propose something and then we will do a research. But what about a real-time event? Are we able, as anthropologists, for example, to immediately do an ethnography when something happens? Like, what if aliens invade the Earth right now? Do we have this recognition that we can do ethnography right away, or are we prepared? So I think there's some kind of static the assumption of a steady state in our academia, and because of, if we're dealing with crisis, then we have to be more anticipatory in our research methods. And in terms of who can we collaborate with, well, definitely the public health establishment. So I deliberately use the word establishment there because sometimes they can also be implicated in medical populism. Many of these political performances received support from public health officials, and they themselves need to be in a way that they need to be criticized. We need to be also critical of the role of public health in either enabling or tolerating these kinds of performances, but at the same time recognizing their potential to channel whatever political logics politicians have. They have the potential to actually mediate and channel them into ways that are more productive. So the role of expertise needs to be also looked at, and that brings us to social STS studies in conversation with area studies scholars. And what we still lack today is the historical context of all of how this unfolds. Was there medical populism during the times of the Spanish or the 1918 pandemic, for example? Do we know enough of how political responses took place in health crisis in the past? We may not be. So if we are to be more interdisciplinary about this, then we have to also involve history. So I definitely see different fields can come together to look at the politics of healthcare in a more nuanced and in a broader perspective.
Absolutely. Very important point, as you are mentioning, to look beyond key actors or key governmental actors. There is a constellation of actors that can participate in the crafting of a medical populist discourse, and experts themselves can participate in that process. A whole range of primary definers is fascinating. And on that note, I'm going to jump to another question by Dr. Munsey, Dr. Stephen Munsey, who's asking, what do you see as some of the implications of medical populism for health information and communication strategies and the training of health communicators? And that's a very important question, Stephen. Thank you so much for asking. And Gideon, you are a teaching academic as well, and would love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen, for that. It's really very challenging. These are questions that I don't really have really complete answers to. They're really, I feel that it's something that has been revealed during the pandemic as sorely lacking in many jurisdictions, because if we are to counter spectacle, if we are to counter simplified narratives, then it always behooves us to ask ourselves, can we respond in the same level of interest and in the same valence as those that are propagating these kinds of rhetoric? So one possible pathway, I think, to look at as a scholar is to look at how ideas actually travel and end up being politicized. So, for example, I'm now also working on a paper that looks at how Lancet articles, or how articles from the Lancet end up in public discourse in the Philippines, and what happens along the way, and who takes that up. One case study, for instance, is the face shield. So among many countries in the world, I believe Philippines is very unique that face shields became required even outdoors. So there was really, for almost 1 year, I believe, face shields were required technically in the Philippines. And that was based on a Lancet article that was a systematic review of interventions that can help outbreaks, that was published very early on during the pandemic, I believe May or June 2020. And some of the public health experts in the Philippines interpreted that paper from the Lancet as meaning that, oh, look, eye protection can add some kind of benefit and it can prevent, so let's recommend eye protection. And because of these face shields that were being sold in the market, they said, oh, let's recommend this. And eventually it became public policy. It became required. I was very critical later on, but I didn't even have the courage to call it out until several months later. So if you were the writer of that Lancet article and you knew that somewhere down the line, certain politicians in certain jurisdictions, including Philippines and to a certain extent Peru, also adopted that, what would you have said in that paper? Can you have written it differently in a way to anticipate and to preempt any kind of simplified application? So I think that's an invitation for communications, at least at the part of scholars, to anticipate what kinds of effects it can be. Some of these ivermectin, some of these pharmaceutical messianism we saw during the pandemic, including chloroquine, ivermectin, were also based on actual papers that were retracted, but then they were published. So it's also an invitation again for editors of journals and all of these academic people to be even more mindful of the real life effects of these publications. And we know that a lot of the medical populism in vaccine scandals around the world was also based in this measles autism link that was also published in the Lancet, I believe 1998. So that's one very small intervention. And of course, at the level of public health, I believe that in terms of communication strategy, it really has to be a long-term attempt to maintain a trustful relation with the public. We cannot just show up and during crises and say, believe in us, because otherwise the vacuum will be filled by politicians and medical influencers. So they're another group, interesting species that has emerged since this past few years of these individuals who have some expertise and have a lot of social media traction, and they gain so much following, they gain so much influence in different countries. They have millions of followers, TikTok, Facebook. They're not necessarily government officials. They're not necessarily recognized experts, but they have some credentials and they exert a lot of influence as well. And they can either be antagonists in this challenge for communication, but they can also be allies. We can also recognize that they're influential to the public and they can be mobilized as well. So mapping what information people actually have and who they trust in terms of health really matters a lot as well. In terms of health communications, I believe we need to look at these medical influencers. And we're also trying to look at that and really going beyond just this medical populist and looking at who else is part of this emerging field that has so much influence and can shape public policy and responses to crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gideon. And we're approaching almost the end of our session, but we still have a couple of questions to go through. And one of them comes from our very own Dr. Trevor Hogan. And Trevor says, thanks, Gideon. You note the systematic persecution of the Muslim population in India by Modi and the BJP. COVID provided a new alibi for a pre-existing program. What about Duterte's government during COVID? Did they use the epidemic as a pretext for systematic targeting of minority groups like Muslims and indigenous peoples or not? Were there any patterns of interest? I think that would be the question in the case of Duterte's government.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I failed to mention that, yes, Duterte also did so. In particular, we saw how the pandemic emergency was also used to stifle dissent. So activists were, in the name of COVID rules, activists were targeted. People who were voicing disagreement in social media were also targeted and also labeled as being enemies of the state. So there was a time when I think there's some people just posting tweets or posts in social media critical of the government, and they received some kind of penalties. And we know that the movements of people were very restricted. So a lot of people who were already vulnerable to begin with, politically speaking, were even more vulnerable during the time. And I myself, being a columnist in a newspaper, and of course everyone was locked down, so I myself felt that climate of fear during the pandemic. In terms of particular groups, for example, indigenous peoples, I wouldn't say that they were systematically targeted by the government, but at the same time, they were also on the receiving end of pre-existing threats that were enabled in part by the state, including militarization. There was no way to protest environmental damage, for example, people building all kinds of projects. Eventually, it turned out, for example, in Palawan, they had this reclamation project that didn't have any approval in indigenous land, but that was able to push through without any question because no one's watching, and the activists were also locked down. So many people, including those who had state blessing, I would say, received encouragement or had the go signal to basically do what they want at the expense of marginalized groups, including indigenous peoples as well. And the pandemic coincided with a lot of attacks, even on healthcare workers, We saw how healthcare workers were red tagged or accused of being part of the Communist Party or part of the rebel army in the Philippines, which made them vulnerable to imprisonment, detention, and even getting killed. So the fog of COVID definitely impacted many people who were vulnerable to begin with. And many scholars rightfully likened that to what the drug war, how the drug war took place. It also was used by Duterte to go after critics. And until now, for example, Laila de Lima, the senator who was critical of Duterte, is still in jail, even though it's a welcome news that today one of her cases was acquitted, but she was acquitted of one of the 3 drug cases filed against her. So there's one more case left, but the damage has been done. 6 years of detention. She's still in jail. So it definitely was used. The drug war, which is also, I believe, a populist performance, was used to go after certain enemies of the state, and it was replicated in some way during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gideon. And no, as you are pointing out, there is, of course, the connection between medical populism and the threats to democracy that have happened in different countries around the world. The connection with regime politics is particularly interesting, both in terms of democratic erosion, but also as Maria Lourdes, as Consul Maria Lourdes Salcedo points out, it can also be used as very effectively as a tool for mustering political support. As you pointed out in your presentation, Maria Lourdes' comments, Victoria Premier Daniel Andrews was heavily criticized using the pandemic to control people. However, at the state elections in November 2022, his party, the Labour Party, and his team attributed the success to right policies during the pandemic. And definitely, this is something that we highlighted, that the Australian context offers very fertile, very interesting ground for reflections connected to some of the tensions that you are capturing with the medical populism framework. Last question that I'm going to comment, and Nikos has a couple of questions, and one has to do with the theoretical framework. I mean, this has a very interesting your framework has very interesting connections, of course, for questions of social theory and for other concepts, for example, Foucault, biopolitics. And he also comments medical populist performances seem to be deployed not only by state agencies, but also by non-state and so-called deviant and other actors in the periphery. Instructive that Dr. Gideon refers to STS to locate the theoretical future of this concept. So any last questions with respect to those issues?
Well, I would just like to say that it's a constant effort. It's an ongoing process to learn and to, this is fairly new, and I myself am still in a process of exploration of what are the resonances, how we can take this further. So I'm really inviting people who are interested to actually also tinker with this concept, critique it, and deconstruct it, and also take it further. It's definitely something that I believe is relevant still, and it will continue to be in light of our ongoing challenges in society and even environmental crisis and so many other things that are happening. So even though it harks back, and in our earliest formulations, we were invoking moral panics, which is also a very old social theory. And of course, even the kings at the time, we look all the way back to history, we can see how even the royals in Europe were viewed as having the power to heal people. So this idea of politics and health really goes back a long way. And it's really an invitation for us to think further of how this will unfold. So, and yes, so I think that as an anthropologist, I always try to look at theory in terms of what we can, how the data points to it and how it can teach us more. So I believe that exploring these other actors that are involved, as you rightfully point out, including non-state actors, might also give us more insight, and it can help us develop this further.
Thank you so much, Gideon. And by the way, I'm gonna leave you with one big question that we're not gonna have time to answer, but I hope that we can follow up in our ongoing conversation by email. It's by our esteemed colleague here at La Trobe, Nick Barry. Thanks, Gideon. Great presentation. Medical populism is a very useful concept for making sense of contemporary politics and health policy. In terms of clarifying the concept, I was wondering whether your view is that all four criteria that you point out in your presentation and in your work must be met for something, a government's approach to a health issue, to count as medical populism. This might have implications for whether or not it's appropriate to make normative judgments about medical populism. And in fact, Nick is a political theorist, and hence his question in this respect. For example, the provision of masks in Singapore might have involved at the time simplification and spectacularization, but not division of false knowledge claims. And that definitely opens up another very fertile conversation with respect to what counts and what doesn't in your conceptual framework, and even for questions of measurement in comparative perspective. I'm unfortunately gonna have to stop us there. If you want to say a couple of comments perhaps after the question, and one last line or two before we leave. Also, before I forget, two things. First, we want to, of course, encourage you to check out our publications. That will be more than welcome to have your contribution, for instance, in La Trobe, Asia, or for example, in Thesis 11. These are, as you know, journals that are part of the larger family that the Philippines-Australia Forum is proud to be part of. And of course, remind you once again, as always, that this is your home. Whenever you want to come virtually or in person, we're here, of course. And I'll leave you to it for last few words.
Well, I just want to express my gratitude for all the comments, all the supportive and constructive feedback that I've received in this very short period we have. I hope we can continue the conversation. I will continue my scholarship, and I really look forward to meeting all of you, hopefully in person in the future. I'm really very thankful for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Gideon. As you can see, you have a whole group here that has been very, very pleased with your presentation. And we thank you once again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.